to do with tree swallows, right? So if you talk about the temperature getting warmer, tree swallows aren't here in February, so it doesn't matter if our nights are getting warmer. So I know from another study, Marches are warmer, but Mays are cooler. So now we've got an aha moment that maybe that's causing at least the later nesting that we're seeing, right? Because in the east they found it was warmer and they're nesting earlier. Now we're finding it's cooler and they're nesting later. And we know from Beaverhill, later nests produce fewer young. So they lay fewer eggs and fewer young the later they nest in the season. So now we've got an extra confounding factor going along with the colder May temperatures. Clutch size decreased with cooler May temperatures at Beaverhill. So not a lot, but it's 1 egg per pair on average. So cooler Mays are resulting in fewer eggs. And consequently, they produce fewer young. On average, roughly 1 young per pair less. There's also an issue with climate change of extreme weather. We've all just heard about the hurricane that slammed into Florida and the Carolinas. We know we get weather extremes here. So for example, in 2021, there was a heavy snowfall on May 19th, sub-zero temperatures. The tree swallows are back and they're starting to nest. So obviously there's not a lot of food. The female's job is just to survive. She's not going to be spending energy laying eggs. So they laid fewer eggs. So here's what the temperature looked like. And my clicker's lighting up, but it's not shining very far. So you can see here in July, the temperature in 2021 rocketed up way warmer than elsewhere. And on the right, you can see that's the number of, the success rate of nests. So you can see in 2019, 2020, it was like 95%. And then 2021, a combination of the cold weather and the heat, so both extremes hit them, you just have 60% success rate. So extreme weather tied to climate change is also having an impact. And of course, then the population effect depends how frequently does that happen. And so I don't know that, but how frequently do we get cold spells in May? How frequently do we get hot spells in June or July? And that then, over time, wears a population down. So the second factor I mentioned was drying of Beaverhill Lake. So Beaverhill Lake used to cover 120 square kilometers, but it's basically a giant slough. It was only 1 to 2 meters deep, and 2 meters if you're lucky. By 2000, it was shrinking. By 2005, it was basically gone. A little puddle, maybe the springs in the middle. And it remained dry into the 2010s, and then in 2016, we got a huge rainfall. You may not remember that far back, but it flooded parts of Edmonton. Whitemutt Creek was underwater, Freeway was underwater at Calgary Trail, and that storm continued east, sat to the south of Beaverhill for a day or more, and flooded the area. And Amos Creek, that flows from the south into Beaverhill Lake, ran like a rapids all through August and early September. So it had a huge impact on the lake and started filling it. So that was an extreme weather event that actually benefited the lake by inputting water. And so why is that important? I won't show you my whole graduate thesis, I'll just show you one graph. And that's because a main diet of tree swallows are midges, chironomids. And midges are aquatic insects, the larval form, they live in the water. So if Beaverhill Lake dries up, obviously there's no water, their key food is gone. But if the lake starts to come back, then the midge population will come back and they'll have food. So the graph here shows the quantity of midges taken as a function of their abundance. So it doesn't take very long before that graph plateaus out, and 100% of the diet of swallows is midges. And that's also important because it's tied into when they're laying eggs. Sorry, I'm gonna have to just get my coffee. Getting a frog in my throat. So you can see on the graph here, the production of eggs and the production of midges are closely tied. So the midges come out in the spring, when the water has, the ice is gone, obviously, and that's tied into when they're laying eggs. So if there isn't a lot of food, then the tree swallows are in trouble and won't lay as many eggs. So the drying of the lake, oddly enough, was due in part to the lack of severe summer storms. But in 2016, there was a lot of rain. 2020 was a really wet spring, and the creeks ran ran high, started to fill the lake. The other factor is winter snowfall. But I've realized, and I found papers from a professor in Saskatchewan that backs this up, spring runoff, melting of the snow, is partly a function of how much snow there is, but it's also a function of how dry is the soil. So if we have a dry autumn, like we're having now, we've had a little bit of rain, but not much, then the ground freezes like a sponge. And when the snow melts, it goes straight into the ground. You don't get runoff, the streams don't fill up, Beaverhill Lake doesn't fill up. If we get a rain in the next month or so and the ground freezes, then it's like a skating rink. And that first snow that melts lands on that frozen ground, runs off, fills up the creeks, that fills up Beaverhill Lake. So the spring runoff is a function of both the autumn rainfall and snowfall. So we have to factor that in while we're contemplating what's happening. So here's what happened to Beaverhill in 1985. You can see that aerial shot. And in 2013, the lake was gone. It wasn't even in the photo at roughly exactly the same angle. You can also see the forest filled in. So if you've been to the Bird Observatory, it's now a site in the forest, whereas in 1984-85, it was in a willow meadow, and that's got implications for other birds as well, but not strictly for this talk. However, it started refilling 2016 to 2019. There were ideal conditions. I mentioned spring of 2020. Here's what it looked like in October of 2017, so only a couple of years of filling. But remember, it's very shallow, so it doesn't take a lot of water to spread out to start to fill it up. Here's another spring. So this was the spring of 2017-18, where we had wet fall, good snowfall, and then heavy runoff in 2018. And the lake started to fill up, and we get these big wetlands, and also the snow geese have come back. So I'll put in a side plug here for the Snow Goose Festival, which will be the last weekend of April next year. So I hope you all come out, and if you're a good birder, then help us on the buses, volunteer. And if you're a learning birder, jump on a bus and learn from one of the volunteers all about waterfowl. So back to tree swallows. So as I mentioned, the clutch size had declined from 84 to 2012. Thanks to Megan, we have the graph getting to 2012. And then you see the big blue dot off to the right there. That's the average number of eggs in 2021, 22, and 23. So they're actually back up to 6.4 per pair. So we've now got an aha moment where the drying of the lake was a key factor driving the decline in productivity, particularly the number of eggs. It doesn't explain some of the other factors like why fewer pairs, but definitely the water in the lake and the food supply is a factor we need to consider. So let's have a look also how are tree swallow populations doing elsewhere. So one of the key ways of tracking bird populations in North America is a roadside survey done often by volunteers. It's 50 stops, 3 minutes per stop early in the morning, and you record all the birds you hear and see. And it's called a breeding bird survey. And it shows that in Canada overall, there's been a decline of 2% per year over the last 40 to 50 years. So a decline over the whole country, so separate from what's happening just at Beaverhill. And we can't really blame the drying of Beaverhill Lake for the swallow populations in Quebec and Ontario and et cetera. However, in the trends in Alberta has actually been an increase in those years. So it gets a bit complicated trying to figure out what's going on. So one has to then look at a map like this. So blue are areas where tree swallow numbers are increasing, and red is where they're decreasing. So you can see there's a band in the northern states that stretches up into Alberta where they're increasing, but they're decreasing in BC and then decreasing across most of southern Canada. So that's where we got the 2% per year decline across Canada, but obviously something different happening in Alberta. But even within Alberta, we can look at different ecoregions. So the prairie pothole has increased 4% per year, but in the boreal hardwood, so the areas to the north of us, it's actually declined to 5% per year. So it starts to get pretty complicated to figure out the causes for all these regional differences, so we won't attempt that. But one thing to also consider, the earlier map showed where they're increasing and decreasing, but we also need to look at where are they most abundant. So if you remember, they were increasing a lot in the central US states, but they're actually not very common there. So it's easy, if you don't have many swallows, it's easy to double the number because you've got a very low number to start with. Whereas if you look across southern Canada, including Alberta, there are far more tree swallows, or much higher densities, so population changes over that time are much more important to monitor and figure out what's going on. So there's a geographic characteristic that we need to consider. How are other species doing? Well, you may have seen this graph elsewhere. This was from a report in 2019, I think it was, that we've lost about a third of the birds in North America over the last 50 years. So we're not just talking swallows now, we're talking birds in general, although again, when you do averages, not everybody's going down. So waterfowl have increased 150%, presumably thanks to the North American Waterfowl Management Plan saving wetlands. Raptors have increased over that time frame because we banned DDT, and some of us were busy breeding peregrine falcons, as I've talked about. I don't know why turkeys have increased 200%, but having worked for government for 36 years, I can tell you they were more common in the office when I retired than they were when I started. And I can say that now I'm retired. If we look at the trends per species group, again, waterfowl, birds of prey are at the top, increasing, and at the bottom we've got shorebirds, grassland birds, because we're plowing up the prairies, and outside we were talking about burring owls and their decline, and then aerial insectivores, so swallows, flycatchers, nighthawks. And this sort of shows the same thing, but broken out into different biomes, so eastern forest birds, Arctic tundra birds, western birds, and the biggest decrease are the aerial insectivores. So there's a paper that analyzed these trends in 2010, and the goal was to look at population changes across Canada and the United States using the breeding bird surveys like I've just talked about. And what they found was that, not surprisingly, aerial insectivores were declining more rapidly than any other group of birds, and the decline was more strong in the east and north than it was elsewhere. And so you can see the area in red for tree swallows is where they found the highest declines, which is, not rocket science, because you can see that looking at the picture, whereas the trends weren't as severe elsewhere. So again, red is declines. This is for barn swallows. So obviously barn swallows aren't doing very well, except in the very southern US. And likewise for kingbirds. Western kingbird is doing fine, they're increasing, but for whatever reason, the eastern kingbird is declining over most of their range. So there's lots of information available to investigate what's happening to all of these birds. So let's look at another cause. So we've got a broad scale geographic declines, not just at Beaverhill. Well, so what are the broad scale possible causes of a decline? And one are pesticides. You've probably all heard about neonicotinoids and bees. So bees are being killed by neonics as a short form. Well, neonics kill all insects, not just bees. It's just that beekeepers have raised the alarm because they're seeing the bees dying. And they're sprayed on seeds before they're planted. So when a farmer buys the seed stock, the granary, they've already got neonics on them. It's not a choice. In fact, I gather it's very hard to buy seeds without neonics sprayed on them already. And they're on there to discourage insects from biting into the seed before it sprouts and starts to grow. But it's actually being banned in Europe. It's especially used in canola and corn. And I guess I've covered those points. So a researcher, Dr. Christy Morrissey at the University of Saskatchewan, have looked at neonics and found the highest levels of neonics in the wetlands in agricultural areas, in fields where there are grains planted, is in the spring before the farmer plants. So the neonics are stable in the soil, it snows, the water melts, it flushes the neonics into the sloughs, and then the farmer comes along and plants and puts some more neonics in the soil. Those neonics that went into the sloughs kill the midges, and guess who eats the midges? You guys already know. So it's having an impact even a year after the neonics are put on the ground. So then that's affecting all insect eaters, not just swallows, but any other birds, grassland birds, etc. So a little side story here, she did a project looking at the effect of neonics on songbirds, particularly white-crowned sparrows. So she fed them 4 to 8 grains for 3 days, and noted that these captive white-crowned sparrows lost weight and their migratory orientation was messed up. So she released them using the MODIS tags. So we haven't really talked about that, but the MODIS system is a way of putting a little transmitter on the bird, and then stationary towers pick up where they're going. And what she found with white-crowned sparrows is the birds that she held in captivity and didn't feed seeds immediately continued their migration. If she fed them seeds, then they stalled their migration for an average of 3.5 days before they resumed their migration. So there's a sublethal effect on the sparrows. It may not be a big deal, but it's something that we don't know anything about, and it's very hard to study. So if it's not killing the food, it's screwing up the birds in their migration and affecting the way they're traveling north. So for 20 years, I studied burrowing owls in southern Alberta and Saskatchewan and Mexico. And as the neonic story evolved, I thought, well, at least the owls are in the open grasslands and they're safe. And then I read a book by Wes Olson, who's a local bison expert, and he talked about cattle are treated with insecticides, ivermectin, dorvermectin. These are insecticides that we treat all of our livestock with, cows and horses in particular, and it kills internal and external parasites for 6 months. So that's pretty huge for livestock owners to be able to get rid of any pesticides or any pests that are infecting their animals. However, it's active in the cattle for 6 months. So when a cattle poops, the cow pie has enough ivermectin in it that insects don't want to touch it. So there's a researcher in Lethbridge, the federal agriculture researcher, Kevin Foote, who's looked at this and found that instead of cow pies being immediately eaten by dung beetles and other flies, they just lie inert on the prairies waiting for frost action to degrade the contents. And so there's an added impact of he's actually measured how much range is lost because the cow pie sits there and the grass can't grow. So the impacts are even beyond a lack of insects. So at Beaverhill Lake, the watershed includes both cropland and cattle pastures. So then we have to wonder, what are the impacts of both of these on the watershed and ultimately on the lake? So we might think we're immune or not, but there was a study done by a graduate student at the University of Alberta that bears indirectly, so it doesn't bear directly on this question. So she was looking at the coloration of tree swallows that are bright green blue on the back, very iridescent, and she wanted to look at heavy metal pollution. And her hypothesis was that with higher pollution in the wetlands in Edmonton, the birds would not have as glossy a back as they did in the natural environment of Beaverhill Lake. So she was doing a control and experiment. Well, it turns out, so it turns out that there's actually, I thought I had one more slide here. It turns out that the levels of copper and zinc are higher at Beaverhill Lake than they are in the city. So then the question is, where's this zinc and copper coming from? And if it's from agricultural runoff, how does that tie in with the insecticides I've just talked about? So I don't know the answer to that. I'm keep talking about it and hoping a a researcher will pop their hand up, or a budding graduate student will say, hey, I'll go and study that and try and find out, do we have a real pollution problem in Beaverhill Lake that we thought was a natural environment separate from all these other human impacts? And I don't know the answer yet, but we'll work on it. So what happens in the winter? Maybe we can blame it on those folks down south where the tree swallows go. That's always a favorite with bird researchers and conservationists. It must be them, it can't be us. So we've put geolocators on tree swallows at Beaverhill Lake. This is part of a coordinated project by Ryan Norris at the University of Guelph. They're little tags that go on the rump of the bird, if you can see it there, and they don't transmit. What they do is they gather information on light level and time. So I don't know who figured this out, but they should get an award for it. Maybe they already have. If you know light level and time, you can figure out dawn and dusk. And if you know time and dawn, you can figure out your longitude around the planet. And if you know day length, so you've got dawn and dusk, you can figure out late day length, except at this time of year when everybody's getting 12 hours of dark and light, you can figure out your latitude. So you can geolocate where the swallow was. The catch is we had to catch them back again, but Helen and I took this on as a retirement project and retrieved more of these geolocators than any other of the 12 projects across North America. So as I mentioned, this was a range-wide study all the way from Nova Scotia to Alaska. The red dots are where the research projects were. The yellow dots are where the tree swallows went for usually about 2 months. So it turns out the swallows leave Beaverhill within a week of the young fledging, and our birds fly to southern Manitoba and the Dakotas, and they stay there for 2 months molting their flight feathers. So birds have to replace their feathers once a year, or most of the feathers, and depends on the species. So it turns out these birds spend the rest of July, August, and a chunk of September molting their feathers one at a time because they need to still be able to fly and feed. And then in September, early October, around this time of year, then they fly down the Mississippi in our case, but they fly south to the blue dots all around the Gulf Coast, and the very southern dot, blue dot in Nicaragua, was actually a bird from Beaverhill. So we're quite pleased with it. It went that far. So in terms of looking for, so there's the actual data for our Beaverhill tree swallows. The green dots are where they were molting, and then the yellow dots are where they wintered. So it's pretty hard, given the previous graph, it's pretty hard to say that something happened somewhere in the wintering grounds is causing the decline across most of Canada, most of the United States. So it's far more likely it's something we're doing here than something we can blame on someone else. As a side note, interesting, bayberry is a common berry in Georgia and Florida, and tree swallows actually land in the trees and eat those berries. So we think of them as eating insects, but yellow rump warblers and tree swallows land in the bayberry trees and eat them. That study that we did with the 11 other researchers across North America allowed the University of Guelph folks to come up with some really cool patterns of timing of migration. And just very quickly, in the winter, at the end of winter, all the populations from Nova Scotia to Alaska basically left their wintering grounds at the same time, but the Alaska birds had further to fly, so they have, I can't go through it in detail, it takes too long, but they have various techniques to catch up. They don't spend as much time goofing around in the spring. When they get to Alaska, it's boom, they're breeding, whereas our birds can spend 2 or 3 weeks goofing around, and then eventually in November, they're leaving those molting grounds and heading back to their wintering grounds. So it's one of the first times anybody's been able to draw a whole circular life history over the geographic range of a species. So Beaverhill Bird Observatory was pretty keen we were able to participate in that. So being a bird watcher and watching what's happening on the Facebook pages, I was struck by this picture in April of 2014 of tree swallows all over a tree in Calgary. There were no tree swallows in Edmonton. There were no tree swallows in southeastern Alberta. There were none in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. I was like, where the heck did all these swallows come from? What's going on? So shortly after that, eBird put out a video of bird migration. Oh, see, it's already activated on its own. So these are pictures for 1 week. All the bird sightings for each week for 52 weeks turned into a 52-week video. So you can see there they are in the summer. You won't be able to read, that's June, towards the end of June. You see the bright white dot, which is right around Beaverhill, so tons of tree swallow sightings here. And then they split up, and they're actually wintering in 2 different areas. So here we're into September. I'm going to let it flip through twice to show you what's happening. So this is October, they're retreating, so there's a population in California and northern Mexico on the west coast. This is now December, January, so you can see the birds are very common in Florida, and now they start coming north. So here I want you to pay attention to what happens to the east and the west, and I can't easily stop it, but notice they're in BC, and then they just jumped across the mountains, and then boom, they come right across the prairies. So in Alberta, we've actually got tree swallows that winter in California and Mexico, and later we've got tree swallows that arrive from Florida and the Gulf Coast, and they all mix up here. So that creates lots of other questions. What happens if a male from California meets a female from Florida and they breed in Alberta? Where do the young go? Nobody knows. And this is likely a carryover from glaciers. So if you think of northern flickers that have a yellow and a red-shafted, red developed in the west coast, yellow from the east when they were separated by the glaciers. I wonder if there's actually 2 different morphs of tree swallows, and we've never really looked closely to see if there's a difference, but there's definitely a difference in the migration of these 2 populations. But that's further evidence that we can't really blame somewhere in the winter for our declines and our population changes in the summer. We have to continue to look what's happening here. So, just as wrapping it up now, so at Beaverhill, we know we've got fewer eggs, fewer young, nesting later, fewer pairs, and lower success rate, but the populations are declining in the breeding season across North America, regardless of where they spend the winter. So there's still things happening at a broader scale than just Beaverhill Lake. So potential causes are climate change related, colder spring temperatures, especially in May, like 2021, the drying of the lake, that explains some of our local changes at Beaverhill Lake, and then the refilling of the lake has resulted in more young. And then if there's and I don't know if there is, an increased frequency of either severe cold weather or the heat domes, and if they become more common and more widespread, then where do they have an impact? The one factor we've looked at that is widespread are the insecticides, so neonicotinoids and ivermectin. We know they're used broad scale wherever there's agriculture in North America. They're in use. I think I mentioned they're banned in Europe now, and yet we still continue to use them, and we use them what's called prophylactically. So farmers get them on the seed, they don't get the insecticide on seed. It's not a case of spraying if you have an insect problem. You simply have the insecticide everywhere. We know very little about where they're staging. So the concentration of tree swallows in, for example, southern Manitoba and the Dakotas, we don't have much information about whether they're successful there or not. So that's still an unknown. And then the wintering areas, they're dispersed. So we feel there's less likely to be a concern about what's happening in the winter. It's definitely a summering problem. So I suggest that swallows are harbingers of a new threat, both a combination of climate change impacts and pesticides, neonics, and ivermectin. One good news in the climate change, and this just happened a couple of days ago, the United Kingdom closed its last coal power plant on October 1st. And so they've been using, my grandfather may or may not be happy, they've been using coal for power plants for 142 years since Thomas Edison first fired one up to light light bulbs, and they finally shut it down. So hopefully from a climate change perspective, that's a bit of positive news. So with that, thank you very much for your interest, and if there's time for questions, I'll take them. And I have to put a plug in if you'd like a copy of Wildlife of the North. It's only $30. It's a coffee table book, so it's pretty cheap for a coffee table book. Makes a great Christmas present, or makes, if there's time between now and then to read it yourself, take care of it and then pass it on as a Christmas present afterwards. Yeah, Rocky.
So is the neonics and the ivermectin, and then you say question mark, maybe other pesticides, I'm wanting to put BTI in there because of its effect on midges in particular.
Yep.
So I have two questions. Are midges, are all swallows eating the same kind of insects? Like, would bank swallows also be going for the midges and that kind of stuff? So that's one question. And then the second is, do we know much about, like, in the biosphere area, in the area all around the Beaverhill Bird Observatory? Do you have much of a map of how much of these chemicals are being used? Like does Elk Island, for example, use any neonics or ivermectin or BTI, or do you have a sense of what is in the area?
Okay, so Rocky's testing my memory by asking two questions in a row, and I got to remember them. So the first, she was commenting on BTI, which is a bacterial agent that's sprayed in Edmonton to squash mosquitoes. But live ivermectin, it kills all insects. So in Edmonton, there used to be purple martins and nighthawks, and they eat larger insects, but most of those insects come out of the water, right? So you're killing the food chain of the insects that those birds would have eaten. There's still enough insects to support some tree swallows, but I don't know anyone mapping the data for tree swallows and BTI. BTI, as I understand it, is used fairly restrictively in cities. It's not broadly used for insect control elsewhere. So it could be implicated in local population declines like purple martins and nighthawks, but not likely a broad scale one. And then the second part of Rocky's question was, what about insecticides in the Beaver Hills, Elk Island, and places like that? As far as I know, and I guess I should ask the park this, I don't think they use ivermectin on cattle, on bison, sorry. I think the bison are okay. It would make a great study to go there or to go to Grasslands Park where they've reintroduced bison and look at bison pies and has the insect population recovered and are insects abundant and taking out. I mean, if you've ever, I've been to Africa a few times, and I remember once watching a herd of elephants cross the road in front of us, and they pooped, and once the elephants had gone, we got out to look at the poop, and there were dung beetles, which are quite big there, making balls of dung about the size of a golf ball, and then arguing over whose it was, pushing it away, and they're going to bury that, lay an egg in it, and so they're taking that carbon, putting it underground, but the egg then lives in it because it's moist, and then the egg hatches out, and you've got another group of dung beetles. I don't know if anyone's doing that in Canada and looking at the bison that are introduced without ivermectin, dorvermectin. But I don't think, certainly any cattle in the Beaver Hills are going to get treated. As far as I know, and Kim's nodding her head, I think it's pretty standard that they get treated twice a year with ivermectin, dorvermectin, one of those. Yeah. Yep. Yes.
I'm not sure if it's a question or observation, but I've been fly fishing for about 35 or 40 years. In the last few years, we've seen a dramatic decrease in fish, but also on insect population, chironomids, midges, and talking to a couple of guides in southern Alberta this year and central Alberta. That's one of the things that they were saying is, not to complain about some people, but they're saying that with some of the pesticides and that logging companies are spraying on trees is impacting the insect reproduction in so many of our bodies of water. which is, I think, in turn affecting the fish. And we've seen
Right.
it, and the birds, of course. And when we're out fishing, if there's a good hatch of bugs, we see lots of swallows. And the last 2 to 5 years, we see very little bird activity. So
Right.
I'm just wondering if there's a bit of a correlation here of
Yep.
pesticides and a lot of the areas I fish in central Alberta is cattle country. Okay, so again, I'm not sure if there's a correlation.
Right.
It's just something else for me to think of other
Right.
than just the.
Can the folks at the back hear what the gentleman was saying? Okay, so I'll just try and quickly, he's a fly fisherman and he's noticed far fewer insects and consequently fewer fish in the rivers where he's fishing. And he's wondering if there's a relationship between the insecticides I've talked about, both the agricultural one, neonicotinoids, and ivermectin, dorvermectin. And of course, those creeks and rivers are coming through agricultural. Often they start in rangeland and then come into agricultural cropland. And I suspect, yeah, there's every reason to think that's that relationship. Obviously, I don't have data, but the correlation's there. That,
It just really,
yeah.
I'm just seeing parallels. That's
Yeah,
what, you know,
no, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's, we have to thank Christy Morrissey at the University of Saskatchewan for doing that kind of detailed research to figure out what's happening in there, in that case, to neonicotinoids in the wetlands.
Right.
And certainly if they're in the ponds, then ultimately it's going to go in the creeks. Yep, for sure.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Yes?
This is kind of outside the scope of your talk, so no worries if you don't know. But at the start, you were talking about canaries and coal mines, and I was just curious, do you know why canaries in particular were used over easier source of birds?
I'll ask my granddad and get back to you.
No worries.
So the question was, why canaries? I don't know, other than they're common pet birds, and it could be that somebody stumbled on that accidentally, 200 years ago. But yeah, I don't know the origin of doing that. Sorry.
No worries. Figured it was worth a shot.
No, it was worth it. I'm glad you stumped me on one question. Okay, so no more hard questions, okay? Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering if there's any potentially planned management strategies to prevent Beaverhill Lake from drying up.
So the question is there any management strategies to prevent Beaverhill Lake from drying up? There was a wild one, but it was tied into coal mining. So there's coal underneath Beaver County, and a company wanted to do open pit coal mining. But coal mining, as you know, requires a lot of water to wash the coal to get rid of the dust. So they're going to pump the water out of the North Saskatchewan River up into the lake and then use that as a water supply. And of course, that never happened. There isn't enough water in the river to do that, and it would be incredibly expensive. So no, I think Beaverhill Lake is just going to have to take its chances. Probably the only thing that could be done is there are a lot of small dams upstream on the creeks leading into Beaverhill. And certainly there's one gentleman who's argued that all these dams cumulatively are holding water back that could or should flow into Beaverhill. But at the same time, those dams are kind of like beaver dams that are replenishing the groundwater. So if the groundwater goes up, then Beaverhill Lake will benefit from that. And if you're from the Beaver Hills, you may already know Cooking Lake has dried up in the last couple of years. So where Beaverhill has been refilling, Cooking Lake has actually dried up. So it's quite hard to tease apart why these different lakes are not going up and down the same way. A Stoughton Lake in Elk Island is doing pretty well. It's down a little bit, but it's nowhere near drying up the way Beaverhill did in the past and the way Cooking Lake has done recently. So even within a small geographic area, the lakes are reacting differently to whatever parameters are controlling them. Yep.
Yeah, so I noticed that there used to be a lot of swallows around the big lake in St. Albert, and that's also drying up. And there's a lot of
Cattails?
cattail plants, and I'm wondering if the cattail plant could also, even though it's kind of helping the drying process, could it also be reversed in the sense like if we took some of that out of there?
Yeah, so the observation is that Big Lake's drying up and there's more cattails. And yeah, I don't really know the impact of evapotranspiration of cattails. Like, we know that trees suck water out of the ground. I assume cattails do. But there's also the impact or the benefit that cattails shade the water so there'd be less direct evaporation, keeping the water cool. So I don't know where the balance would be, you know, the impact of more cattails or fewer cattails. That's a good question. Sounds like another graduate study. Yep.
Much easier question this time. How's the water level been doing in Beaverhill Lake over about the last year or so?
Well, how has the water level been doing in Beaverhill Lake? Well, it's sort of up and down.
Yeah.
We don't closely track it because right now the shoreline is far enough away from the bird observatory. We just look at a distance. Certainly in the spring, we had some reasonable spring rains and it came up. There was virtually no runoff. And again, the soil was dry from last fall. But then since then, it's been warm with very little rain in the second half of the summer, which is great for the farmers' crops, but the lake has receded from that. I can't put a number to it. And again, it's very shallow, so it's, you know, it's like a dinner plate. It doesn't take much decrease in depth to be a large decrease in area. But there's water out there. If you come from Toefield, from the main street in Toefield, and stop just before Highway 833, there's a height of land, and you can see over the bands of cattails, you can see there's still lots of open water out there.
Thank you.
No.
Over here?
Oh, sorry. Yep.
I was just looking at your last slide here. Would you like to speak to it?
Sure. I always try and put this, and I realized I should have. I usually have one at the start and one at the end, so when people are gathering, they can read the list. So one of the points of giving talks is to try and get people to take personal responsibility for their own actions. And that's really what this list is about. So things that you can do to decrease your impact on the environment. And of course, there's many ways to accomplish some of these, like reducing your carbon footprint. So that means you all have to walk home. You can't take a car. Or if you came by bicycle, good for you, including me, yep. Window protection is a huge one. You know, the windows here should have dots all over them. If you don't like dots, I have, you know, the trellis mesh that you can get for let vines grow up. That's what I have on my windows, but I have a wooden outer steering outside so I can easily put screws, and if you've got a fine finish like this, then the dots on the windows are the best way to go. Or you can draw vertical lines 3 inches apart. You go to Michael's and get the acrylic ink pens, sort of like a pen, but it's acrylic paint inside, and draw lines every 3 inches. Then the birds flying up see that, realize their wings are wider than that, and they flare off. So protecting windows, keeping cats indoors, planting native plants, which is good for insects, reducing lawn, avoiding pesticides. We talked about bird-friendly coffee, and I've got to track that down so that we're doing that at the Bird Observatory. We haven't been. Reducing our use of plastics overall and getting them into recycling. And if they're not being properly recycled, then be after our city council to properly recycle or find another use for plastics. Generally sharing and appreciating nature, so people who are not aware of nature, getting them hooked. And sometimes it just takes one instance. For me, when I was a kid, I got tuberculosis and spent 2 rounds in a hospital in England and watched a European robin going up and down the hedgerow. In retrospect, I think it was probably feeding, but I just remember watching it going back and forth. And when I got home, I asked one of my uncles to take me bird watching, and I still got the bird books. And I joked that I'm still the teenager living his dream. I decided I was going to get a PhD and study birds, and here I am all these years later still doing it. Become a citizen science, so programs like eBird and iNaturalist, eButterfly are terrific. Take your smartphone along, and whenever you see a flower or a bug or whatever, put it into iNaturalist. That becomes a database. The experts tell you what it is. That's a fun part, but you're also contributing to a continent-wide database. So graphs, like I showed you there, the video of tree swallows, are the result of thousands of people putting their tree swallow boxes or tree swallow records into eBird week after week. And then finally, supporting conservation groups. Join join groups, donate to them. A lot of people don't seem to realize our tax structure. So if you're at the end of the year, you're adding up all your charitable donations. The first $200, you only get $17. You get $34 back on $200 in tax credits. After that, you get 50% back. So if you gave $1,000 to the Beaverhill Bird Observatory, you get $500 back in tax credits. So you get a double feeling. I love doing the tax at the end of the year, and it's like I owe them, the federal government, provincial government, several $1,000s. And then the last thing you do is you put it in charitable donations, and they end up owing me a couple of $1,000, and I love that. It gives me a nice warm feeling, and I already got a warm feeling from making the donations. So yeah, recognize that getting charitable donations, you get half of it back at the end of the year. So yeah.
Question about the bird-friendly coffee. So I'm aware about out of Ontario, but I mean, any place else in Canada?
Well, these folks just get it, and where did they say they got it? Oops.
Like, do you sell in bulk here too?
We do sell bags, correct? Yeah, and we had actually done a lot of research because we were looking for somewhere as local as well, but we do get ours from out east as well. But we were looking at, and our executive director for the Valley Zoo Development Society, there's a lot
There
of
it is.
Tiana. She did a lot of research in terms, including what packaging is best, because often you'll get good sustainable coffee, but they come in these completely unsustainable packages. It makes the shelf life, I think, slightly shorter, but I mean, if you all love coffee, like all of us, that shouldn't be a problem. So yes, there aren't a lot in Western Canada, there are some in Eastern Canada, but the goal here is to, and I think we're the only ones who actually sell bags. I know there was some Wild Bird Unlimited used to try to sell it, but they just didn't have the coffee market. And so we're hoping that here we can at least provide in the West here. So if anybody wants to get a monthly source, I'm sure we could be your suppliers.
Good. I could. So if you're not familiar, bird-friendly coffee is coffee grown in the shade underneath the tropical forest. So instead of clearing the forest and growing the coffee out in the open with no tree canopy and very little value to birds, either resident or our migrant birds, the undergrowth is partially cleared and coffee is grown underneath. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and this guru on coffee says that the beans mature a bit slower and they actually end up much tastier. So you end up with better tasting coffee rather than in the beating sun where it's partially cooked by the sun by the time it's ready to harvest. So it's got a double benefit. It actually tastes better, but then the overstory, the forest is still intact and the birds can use that, and a lot of the understory is still intact. So there's space for ground and shrub birds as well as forest birds.
That's wonderful.
It's not a question so much, but one more thing I think we should add to our conservation actions is to be water wise. You know,
Mm-hmm.
Just finished reading Hanukkah Gorman's book on water. This book is like 10 years old. I'm embarrassed that I'm just reading it now, but what an eye opener! Like if we're talking about the lake levels and water rivers and all of that, it's a huge thing, and we're basically, her premise is that in Canada and North America, we just have this sense that there's an unlimited supply, and there isn't.
Right. So Kim's comment is to add to my list being water wise, being conscious of the water that one is using. And one way to do that would be to, if I go on holiday, you can have my house for a month. I have to truck my water in. I'm not on a pipeline, and I have to pay for the water to go out the other end. So when I go to have a shower, I get wet, turn it off, soap up, turn the water on, and wash it off, and then turn it off again. I'm very stingy with flushing toilets. I won't go into the details, but you can imagine. But if it's yellow, let it mellow. And yeah, so many other ways. And we've seen that in southern Alberta. The Old Man River's drying up. So towns like Coaldale, or not Coaldale, anyway, in the mountain pass there, they're actually trucking water in for the town supply because the reservoir is gone. And then, of course, it all happened in Calgary when the main pipeline burst. They were able to drastically reduce water use. So the comment would be, keep that up, whatever folks were doing, and we should be doing the same. It's a lot of energy to purify the water and then pump it into our kitchens or in our bathrooms. So being water wise is definitely something else to add there. Great.
Well, with that, I would like to get us all together to thank Dr. Holroyd for this a great talk.
You're very welcome.
So we encourage everybody to stick around, have another bird-friendly coffee if you want. We've also tried to reduce our plastic use. You can see a lot of ours are compostable
Yep, these are good.
cups. We also, I want to introduce you to Isra, who is our conservation student, and she's actually doing a bird strike survey around the zoo. So some of our glass are bird-friendly glass, or we have shutters, but some of our older infrastructure does not, and so we're actually monitoring every morning to see if there are any areas of bird strikes, and then we're finding ways to mitigate, often with the bird feather
Good job.
taking. Yeah, very fascinating. And so with that, though, I'd like to thank everybody for coming out. I want you to keep your eyes open for our next talk, which is November 7th, the first Thursday of every month. We talked a little bit about Elk Island Park. Next November is World Bison Day. So I'm going to let you guess what guest speakers we're going to have. Okay, they're from the Elk Island National Park, and they're going to talk about bison conservation. And we're also going to have the Friends of Elk Island National Park to talk about, to have a table. So with that, I'd like to also thank our bird-friendly partners, the Edmonton River Valley Conservation Coalition, Wild North, and Edmonton Area Land Trust, who were here doing some tabling events. And I'd like to invite everybody, all of these activities, or all of these items, we're going to be also highlighting at our October 12th event. That's the Thanksgiving weekend. Please come to the zoo, because we'll have about 10 partners. Every partner has a table, and they're going to be promoting a potential bird for a Bird City vote. We're going to have little passports for kids to walk around and learn about birds. And we're also going to have a free, if you don't want to come into the zoo, at 3 o'clock, we have a naturalist, Mirna Perlman, who is going to give a free talk in the Adventure Lodge just right across the lake. So October 12th is Fall Migratory Bird Day. Come out for all of our events. Learn about all of these great initiatives that people can do. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone, and feel free to stick around or have a great day.